Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May the peace and blessings of God be with you all. Today is Holocaust Memorial Day. And I'm going to begin with a reading of Eli Wiesel, a survivor of the Holocaust. What is abnormal is that I am normal. That I survived the Holocaust and went on to love beautiful girls, to talk, to write, to have toast and tea, and to live my life. That is what is abnormal. Genocide is facilitated by ordinary people. Ordinary people who turn a blind eye, believe propaganda, join murderous regimes, and those who are persecuted, oppressed, and murdered in genocide are not persecuted because of any crimes which they have committed. They are persecuted simply because they are ordinary people who belong to a particular group. That group, in some cases, it could be the Jews. In others, like in Bosnia or Burma, it could be Muslims. In others, it could be Hindus. Or it could be groups that are because of their sexuality or for some other distinguishing feature, but these are not crimes. These are simply people for being who they are. And ordinary people were involved in all aspects of the Holocaust. Nazi persecution of other groups, and in the genocides that took place in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia and Darfur, ordinary people were perpetrators, were bystanders, rescuers, witnesses, and ordinary people were the victims. Before I go any further, I would like to light a candle to remember the victims of the Holocaust. And I'm going to leave this while I'm doing everything else. I'm going to read the Kaddish by, this is a traditional Jewish prayer, and in respect to the Jewish people who lost their lives in the Holocaust, and also sadly in other pogroms and genocides. I'm going to read the Kaddish. I'm going to read it in English because I do not have Hebrew language skills. It mentions in here the house of Israel, and there's another reference, and all Israel. This is a reference to what we know in Islam as Bani Israel, the people of Israel. It's not a reference to any particular state, but to the descendants of Yaqub alayhi salam, who was also known as Israel. Magnified and sanctified be the great name of the one by whose will the world was created. May God's rule become effective in your lives and in the life of the whole house of Israel. May it be so soon, and let us say, Amen. May God's great name be praised to all eternity. Blessed and praised, glorified, exalted and extolled, lauded, honored, and acclaimed be the name of the Holy One, who is ever to be praised. Though far above eulogies and songs of praise and consolation that human lips can utter, and let us say, Amen. May the great peace descend from heaven, and abundant life be granted to us and all Israel, and let us say, Amen. May the Most High, source of perfect peace, grant peace to us, to all Israel and all humanity, and let us say, Amen. This is a prayer that has been read in many different situations by the Jewish community for centuries. This one is, I think, probably the 13th century that this particular version goes back to. But it's an old prayer. It's been read at the end of classes, and in more recent times, or I don't know when it began exactly, it started being read when people passed away, or when there was a disaster, or something like this. And so I read it to honor my Jewish brothers and sisters and to respect the memory of those who tragically lost their lives due to the Holocaust and also other kinds of genocide and persecutions. Although Jewish people were the main targets of the Holocaust, it wasn't only Jews that suffered in the Holocaust. In those concentration camps, there were also Romani, and there were LGBT people, Freemasons, many different groups that were targeted and persecuted by the Nazis. And we should remember, I mean, it's a tragedy, you know. I'm going to read a little bit about the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was a camp where 90% of the inmates were Jewish, and it was a death camp. You know, it was a really terrible place. After years of discrimination and persecution, the Nazis attempted to murder all the Jews in Europe. In order to achieve this, they built camps designed specifically to kill large numbers of people and to imprison people and to use them as slaves until they died of starvation, disease, or exhaustion. The largest of these camps was Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. Towards the end of the Second World War, Allied troops were pushing the Nazis back out of the countries they had invaded. And discovering these Nazi concentration and extermination camps as they did so. At the end of 1944, the Nazis knew that the Soviet army was making progress towards Poland and began deporting prisoners from the camps there. When the Soviet soldiers arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau on 27th of January 1945, the Nazis were gone. Buildings had been dismantled and burnt as the Nazis attempted to destroy the evidence of their crimes. The only people who remained were those too sick to be moved. The soldiers immediately set up medical facilities and tried to help the starving survivors. They were alive, but they had lost everything. Hundreds died of malnutrition and disease, even after the troops arrived. Many people were so malnourished that their bodies could not cope with the food that they were given. The liberation of the camps exposed the full extent of the Nazis' crimes to the rest of the world. Approximately 1.1 million men, women and children had been murdered at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and over 90% of them were Jewish. In the year 2000, 46 countries came together and decided to create an international Holocaust Memorial Day. The date, 27th of January, was chosen to ensure the world learns how the Holocaust fundamentally challenged the foundations of our civilization. Jewish people were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau from all over Europe, coming from their homes, from ghettos, or from other camps. They were told that they were being taken somewhere new to live, resettlement in the East. How nice does that sound? You know, we're going to give you a place to live and a place to restart your lives. Such was the euphemism and the lies used. They were told not to carry much, but that they could bring luggage to help them start a new life. On arrival at Auschwitz, this luggage was ripped from people's hands as they were taken either straight to their deaths or to become slave laborers. The Nazis amassed enormous amounts of goods belonging to those they had murdered and imprisoned. Clothes, jewelry, shoes, glasses, tools, household objects, and money. Some goods were used by commandos at Auschwitz or sent to Germany. Huge amounts were stored in warehouses, which the prisoners nicknamed Canada because they were a land of plenty. Prisoners worked in these warehouses sorting out the belongings of the fellow prisoners that were executed. Literally, they had huge storehouses of clothes, of pots and pans, of all manner of things that people had. And you think each one was only bringing a small amount of clothes, like the clothes on their back, maybe a small bag, a small amount of pots and pans. And all of this amounted into huge warehouses. You just think, I mean, the evidence is there of the number of people who were murdered and burnt. You know, they cremated the bodies afterwards to destroy the evidence. It was done on an industrial scale. Today, Auschwitz-Birkenau is a museum and a memorial site, and vast collections of these objects are on display to help visitors begin to comprehend the scale of the genocide committed there by the Nazis. Each set of pots represents a family who were hoping for a new life. Kitty Hart Moxon, OBE. Kitty Hart Moxon was a teenager when she and her mother were sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. She says, "We were delivered to the gates of hell. On arrival, we were stripped, whipped, shaved, and tattooed. From then on, we had no names. I was now number 39934, and my mother was number 39933. For many months, I was assigned to dozens of hard labor work groups, and my mother was given a job in the camp sickbay. In spring 1944, I was transferred to work near the gas chambers, the center of extermination of Auschwitz-Birkenau. For 8 months, I worked in the Canada Commando, sorting out the clothes and the belongings stripped from the Jews murdered in the nearby gas chambers. During this period, I witnessed more than 500,000 people, 500,000 people sent to their deaths. We knew roughly how many were murdered because we could count the trains that arrived daily. I knew how many the SS could cram into their cattle trucks. Kitty and her mother were not in Auschwitz when it was liberated. They had been transferred to another camp in Germany. From there, they were sent out on a death march as the Nazis retreated, taking their remaining prisoners with them. Kitty was with lots of female prisoners. They were given no food and were made to walk barefoot through the snow. Anyone who collapsed was shot. In total, they walked over 100 miles. Of the 100 women executed from Auschwitz at the same time as Kitty, only 12 were still alive. So, of the 100 women evacuated from Auschwitz at the same time as Kitty, only 12 were still alive when they were finally liberated on 14th April 1945 by American soldiers. If anybody wants to listen to Kitty speaking about her life story, they can go to hmd.org.uk/Kitty. That's Kitty. I don't know how well you can see that. This is a picture of some of the pots and pans that were recovered from, have I got it the wrong way around there? From Auschwitz-Birkenau. And they had whole warehouses of these pots and pans, and maybe each family, they only had maybe 3 or 4. These belonged to them. And they had huge warehouses full of these, each set representing a family who went there with the hope of starting a new life. And it wasn't just the Jews, although the Jews were the largest group that was persecuted and oppressed and murdered by the Nazis. I'm going to read something about the Gypsy people who were also persecuted. This is titled 13th of June 1938, the start of Gypsy cleanup week. Roma and Sinti people held to camp in central Poland. Here's a picture. Sorry, it's black and white. I printed it on my laser printer. Roma and Sinti people across Europe were targeted by the Nazis for total destruction. From 1933, when Hitler took power, Roma and Sinti people had more of their freedoms restricted by law. I mean, they didn't exactly have that much freedom even beforehand, but whatever freedoms they had were stripped from them. On 13th of June 1938, German police, the police, began a week of operations against Roma and Sinti people in Germany, which they called Gypsy Cleanup Week. These are human beings. Think about the way that that's worded. Within 5 days, over 1,000 Roma and Sinti people had been arrested and deported to concentration camps. This was the beginning of an increasingly extreme program against the Roma and Sinti community that led ultimately to their mass murder in Nazi death camps. Just a few months later, the Nazis arrested and deported over 30,000 Jews during what the Nazis called Kristallnacht, a night of violence and vandalism against the Jewish people. For both Jews and Roma and Sinti people, the year 1938, so this is 1 year before the Second World War began, saw a major escalation of violence against them in Germany, to such an extent that it may be seen as a point of no return on the path to the Nazi genocides of both groups. The Nazis used pseudo-scientific theories of the time to justify their racist policies and crimes. They categorized people by race. And Hitler used the word Aryan for his idea of a pure German race. The Nazis believed Aryan people were superior to all others. Their devotion to their belief in racial purity and their opposition to racial mixing partly underlies the Nazis' hatred towards Jews, Roma, Sinti people, and black people. Basically, anybody who wasn't tall, blonde, white, and blue-eyed. Which is ironic because Hitler was short, dark-haired. I don't think he was blue-eyed either. Yet this was the belief he promulgated. And anybody who didn't fit that fell foul of society. And in the case of Jews, Roma, Sinti people, and black people, were rounded up and put in concentration camps or murdered just because of being who they are. They hadn't committed any crimes. They weren't hurting anybody. This one here. And they used science, actually. I mean, it says pseudo-scientific, but at the time this was regarded as science to justify these crimes because they had scientific theories which are now regarded as pseudo-scientific, but like I said at the time, there were scientists supporting this, believing that people with white skin and blue eyes and a certain like bone structure in the head were more superior and more intelligent. And there were still, even today, there are still some people who believe that. Even though more recent science has proved this all to be nonsense. But these theories were used to justify racist laws, forced sterilization, and murder. The Nazis used equipment like an eye test chart and tools to measure the sizes of people's heads and noses to classify people into different groups. German school children were taught that physical differences between people were signs of moral and intellectual differences too, and that Aryan people were superior in every way. So you have this situation where people who were committing these awful, horrific, terrible crimes were thinking of themselves as being morally and intellectually superior and scientifically superior. But at the same time, these weren't unusual people in the time. These were ordinary people. Ordinary people who were scientists, doctors, people who worked on the railways, who shipped the people to Auschwitz. Ordinary people just doing their jobs. Many of them were not necessarily particularly evil, but most people either stood by and let things happen without doing anything about it, or speaking out about it, or trying to stop it. Others went to work and did what they were told. even if that meant taking people to a concentration camp or to their deaths. And this is true in all genocides. I remember my visit to Bosnia in 2015. And again, it was ordinary people who perpetrated the genocide against the Bosniaks. People that were ordinary neighbors. I'd like to read a story that I found on the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust website about a gentleman named Jack Kagan. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is a picture of him, and he's holding a Star of David, a Magen David. Jack Kagan grew up in Novogrodek, in modern-day Belarus. He fought as part of the Jewish partisan resistance. And here he talks about the Magen David, the Star of David, from Novogrodek's synagogue. That is all that's left from a once thriving Jewish culture in the town. This religious object was buried for 60 years. The man who it now belongs to protected it in the 1940s. It is the only remaining artifact from a synagogue that was destroyed. When you think a synagogue, that's the center of a community, just like a mosque or a church. And hundreds of people probably prayed there at one time. The object comes from a town called Novogrodek. Jack holds a rusty sign. It's about 20 centimeters high, and it is a circle with a Star of David inside. It's a Magen David, the Jewish symbol. The item that Jack is holding was an ornament from a synagogue in his hometown in Novogrodek. Due to changing ruling forces and boundary movements, Novogrodek has been a part of Poland, Lithuania, Russia, and under German and Soviet rule. It is now in the modern-day country of Belarus. This small, on first sight insignificant object is packed full of untold stories. It's a reminder of an entire community which was destroyed under Nazi rule during the Second World War. It's a memory of the lives which were altered beyond recognition, starting from the 22nd of June 1941, when the Nazis seized control of Russia and bombed and burned the town of Novogrodek. The synagogue square was razed to the ground, and seemingly nothing remained. Shortly after the bombing, the Jewish people in Novogrodek and from the surrounding towns were sent to forced labor camps. 250 of the men who were held in that camp miraculously dug a tunnel and escaped. Jack is among them. From his escape, 170 of the prisoners survived to join the partisans, led by the Bielski brothers. The Jewish partisans led a resistance movement against the Nazi authorities. They worked together to fight against the widespread murder and persecution which the Nazis had spread throughout the European countries they occupied. The partisans had to overcome great obstacles in finding clothing, shelter, food, and weapons to keep them alive. 10% of Jack's hometown of 6,000 joined the Bielski partisans. Today, there is no Jewish community in Novogrodek. However, the memory of the destroyed community lives on in such items as the Magen David and the memories of partisans like Jack. He tells us it's the only thing that's left from a whole town that existed for 500 years. Think about that, 500 years. Thriving Jewish community. There were large Jewish communities all across Eastern Europe and in Russia. Today, many of these countries have very few Jews left. The untold story behind the Magen David is told because in 1993, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Jack took a group of Jewish friends to visit Novogrodic and to see the memorials he had helped to create to the 10,000 Jews who were murdered in the town. Jack was present with the ornament. He tells us that the day after the synagogue was burned down, a man passed by. It was the only object lying on the ground. It wasn't that I wanted to take it, but I automatically picked it up and wrapped it in newspaper and took it home. I realized then that if anyone caught me with it, they would kill me. So I buried it. This single action by this hitherto unknown man, Jerzy Pietkiewicz, helped preserve the memory of the Jewish community for 62 years. The Polish man made the decision to give the Magen David to Jack, as it was something which belonged to the Jewish community who were destroyed. Jack says that it wasn't hard for the man to know who he was when 40 people, all Jews, came to a small town. Everybody knows. Jack feels sadness when he looks at the Magen David, just as much as he did when Jerzy Pietkiewicz unwrapped it for the first time. Tears started, because to know that there is at least something left from a whole town which was 50% Jewish, and there was nothing left. Everything was burned down. I see a catastrophe which happened to us. When he returned home with the Magen David, Jack lent it to museums in St. Petersburg and Florida. It is now exhibited in the Jewish Museum in London. It may seem strange to us for Jack to give such a precious object away in this manner, but he explains. It doesn't belong to me. It belonged to the community of Novogrodic. Hiding it under the bed does nothing. At least in a museum, people can see it's an object which came from a place which is no more. It's just one thing left from a whole town. Jack wants us to consider the untold story of this object on the Holocaust Memorial Day. He wants us to remember that there was a bright cultural life in the bubbling town of Novogrodic, which everyone knew, but now only a Magen David remains, because nothing else is left. Whilst we look at this object, I remember the life which was wasted because of Nazi hatred. Jack has a clear wish for us. He wants young people to learn a little bit about what life was like in Eastern Europe, which was demolished, and try to make it that this should never happen again. To think that that is all that remains from a thriving town of 20,000 people. 10,000 of them were Jewish and were murdered for simply being Jews. That's where hate leads. In these cases, it was the Jews. In Bosnia and Srebrenica, it was Muslims. Same hate. Never leads to anything good. I will end with the statement of commitment. We recognize that the Holocaust shook the foundations of modern civilization. Its unprecedented character and horror will always hold universal meaning. We believe the Holocaust must have a permanent place in our nation's collective memory. We honor the survivors still with us and reaffirm our shared goals of mutual understanding and justice. We must make sure that future generations understand the causes of the Holocaust and reflect upon its consequences. We vow to remember the victims of Nazi persecution and of all genocide. We value the sacrifices of those who have risked their lives to protect or rescue victims as a touchstone of the human capacity for good in the face of evil. We recognize that humanity is still scarred by the belief that race, religion, disability, or sexuality makes some people's lives worth less than others. Genocide, anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, and discrimination still continue. We have a shared responsibility to fight these evils. We pledge to strengthen our efforts to promote education and research about the Holocaust and the genocide. We will do our utmost to make sure that the lessons of such events are fully learned. We will continue to encourage Holocaust remembrance by holding an annual UK Holocaust Memorial Day. We condemn the evils of prejudice, discrimination, and racism. We value a free, tolerant, and democratic society. I'm going to read the Fatiha, which is like the Lord's Prayer of Islam. Maybe, inshallah, Allah will bless us with holding to these principles and to building a better world where eventually genocide is no more. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. We seek refuge in God from the devil. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most kind. Praise be to God, the Lord of the worlds. Most merciful, most kind, Master of the day of judgment. You alone we worship. You alone we ask for help. Guide us in the straight path, the way of those whom you have favored, not the way of those who earn your anger or go astray. Amen. Thank you for joining me tonight for this special Friday Reflections for Holocaust Memorial Day. And I hope that you go away like me and learned something about the Holocaust and genocide, and will pass this on to other people. And together, we'll work together to ensure that we put an end to hatred and these kind of evils. Thank you for joining me. Good night.